All right, hello, this is Calvin Andrassy again, and today we're going to be talking about international economics, which is the last major macroeconomic concept that I want to touch upon for the class. It's all about trade, essentially, how individual countries engage in trade and the ideas that go behind that overall concept. So, we have our more classic theories and we have more modernized theories. The classic theories tended to focus on trade as reflective of the countries themselves, okay? It all started with the idea of mercantilism that was all about looking at international trade in terms of the amount of wealth that a country could amass as a result of the trade that it engaged in. So generally, it was all about achieving more trade and having more exports than imports. It was often characterized by protectionism to make sure that countries managed to maintain a high level of wealth generation as the result of trade. And, it was usually based in some of the major commodities like gold and silver and things like that. As those ideas kind of advanced, you first had absolute advantage theory, which was all about countries trying to specialize in goods and services that they have production advantages in. And, of course, the notion of absolute efficiency as well. And then we had comparative advantage theory, which was to basically produce a good or service if you have a comparative advantage, not necessarily just an absolute advantage. And so, countries would produce those goods that have lower opportunity costs and trade with other countries that have lower opportunity costs for other goods and services, so that you had what is known as mutually beneficial trade, where both sides gain as a result of the trade. And then things started to shift. So you had the Hesher-Ohlin model, which looked at factor endowments like land, labor, and capital as the basis for understanding trade, and the land, the labor, and the capital that went into producing the goods that were for export. And then you had Leontief kind of challenge that perspective, bringing in more of an emphasis on what consumers want and more of an emphasis on the technologies available to a country, which led to the more modern theories. So the modern theories then emphasize firms and institutions, and sometimes even the consumers themselves, instead of countries, in an effort to understand why trade is engaged in and what maximizes trade. So, of course, you had Ricardo and the Ricardian theories, which looked at the different types of firms that were present in a country as a way of influencing trade patterns. New trade theory emphasized a lot of different points that kind of arose from just a general discussion in macroeconomics and to some extent microeconomics as well, looking at what companies and what firms within a country have economies of scale, how countries engage in product differentiation, the notion of imperfect competition, and producing large-scale and gain monopolies or oligopolies, basically establishing some degree of market control in an effort to kind of concentrate production, even if you don't necessarily have a comparative advantage. If you're the big game in town that's producing everything, there's no need for anybody to kind of compete with you, since you already have the ability to set prices based on, whatever it is that you're wanting to set the prices as. And that way you can kind of maximize what what your trade is. So, in the case of global trade, you don't necessarily always have the most efficient and functioning markets, and that's something that new trade theory kind of acknowledged, right? Think of it in terms of like soft drinks and the Coca-Cola company, or fast food services and McDonald's, which have, many locations and many distribution centers and whatnot abroad. That there aren't really too many competitive firms that would go against them. Okay, strategic trade policies. The idea of governments intervening to try to support certain firms' global competitiveness, which is essentially in line with protectionism, right? Having the government step in and say, hey, we're gonna issue a tariff on imported steel or something like that, so that our steel companies benefit and remain, on top in terms of the income that is generated as a result of trade. Okay. You have the gravity model arising here, which is basically you're looking at the trade flow as a function of the relative dimensions, if you will, of the country, their size, their ability to produce, and the distance between them. Now, sometimes there's a constant in there, a gravitational constant. But you can forego that and still get a meaningful number. Usually, if that is the case, you have F here as the trade flow, and then G as your constant multiplied by the dimensions over the distance. And of course, you have multilateral trade, bilateral trade. Trade isn't necessarily just one country to another, or one entity to another, but sometimes it goes in steps, right? If you think about the production of, I'm wearing a shirt here, I'm sure that it was probably produced in one country, but from goods from another country, maybe stitched together in yet another country. So you had a bunch of trade take place in order for this shirt to ultimately reach the rack at the dress shirt store that I happened to buy this, right? You also have global value chains, which look at upstream and downstream, basically value added in terms of production. So there's lots of different ways that you can go about looking at what goes into the production of goods and services, and how they ultimately get onto the global market for import and export. Okay. So I mentioned tariffs before. So there are a number of different potential tariffs out there. You have specific tariffs, you have ad valorem tariffs, you have compound tariffs, you have sometimes retaliation by countries for the imposition of tariffs on different items and whatnot. So not too long ago, there was basically a trade war that began between the United States and China. China having a fairly long history of overproducing steel and then kind of dumping it on the markets to drive down the prices, so that the Chinese firms would get to sell their steel at these reduced rates and kind of drive out everybody else, so it's no longer profitable for other firms in other countries to produce that steel, so they no longer participate in the international market, and then China would come back and raise the prices on whatever those products are, in this case steel, and benefit significantly from the lack of competition in the market, right? That would be an example of essentially retaliation in this case, where the United States said, no, we're going to impose a tariff on steel, and then China decided, well, now you're going to have tariffs imposed on goods that are imported to China from the United States. So there's a lot of back and forth in that regard. Okay, trade quotas. So there are sometimes in some countries requirements on how many goods must be imported or exported. Voluntary export restraint is what that's supposed to say. Making sure that essentially that firms within a country are not are able to remain competitive in light of the imports that are coming in, and that they're able to profit from the exports that are essentially going out. And then, of course, you have a wide variety of trade agreements. You have regional trade agreements between, countries that are geographically near each other. You have free trade agreements where there aren't any tariffs or other types of fees and penalties imposed on the goods and services being imported and exported across borders between countries. Preferential trade agreements where certain countries are given preference in trade. There's customs unions, common markets. There's a lot of different ways that international trade ultimately takes place. And, with trade comes the potential for there to be problems arising as a result of trade. So how do we resolve disputes in trade? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways that is done. First and foremost, bilateral talks, discussions between if there's two parties involved in the trade, sitting down and trying to work out whatever the details are that has led to the dispute in the first place. Secondarily, bringing in a third party to mediate discussions, and then, going a step further, bringing in a third party to arbitrate and make decisions on the basis of the facts, so that neither country is ultimately, making the ultimate decision as to how to resolve the problem, but rather, hopefully, an unbiased third party steps in to make those kinds of decisions. Sometimes there are expert panels and commissions being called in. Diplomacy in general is a big part of the trade dispute resolution. So, maybe some sort of a problem arose, so you engage in creative diplomacy and try to find a mutually beneficial agreement or other place in which relations can be improved to kind of smooth away any of those problems. You have trade promotion authorities, organizations that are basically there to try to ensure that trade is going smoothly. And then you have the overarching organization over it all, the World Trade Organization, which replaced the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, known as GATT, that lasted until, I believe, the 1990s. And they have various requirements if you want to be part of the organization, including, dispute settlement understandings in engaging in trade. There's appellate bodies, so if a decision is made, there can be appeals to exhaust any additional complaints or allegations of bias or what have you in the decisions made by the World Trade Organization. So it's this entire system that's in place to try to make trade as fair as possible, essentially. Okay. And then we come to the topic of exchange rates. So, if you've ever done any travel outside of the United States, you may have noticed that not all countries use the United States dollar. In fact, more countries, surprisingly, don't use the United States dollar, but use their own local currency. I say that, of course, facetiously. Japan has the yen, the European Union, by and large, has the euro. Switzerland has the franc. The United Kingdom has the pound. Hungary has the forint. Thailand has the baht. All sorts of different currencies around. Mexico has the peso. I could go on. So essentially, the exchange rate is the price of one currency in the currency of another. Not all currencies are equal. And, the basis for those prices can be based either on floating exchange rates or fixed exchange rates. So floating exchange rates are what, the United States uses, along with Japan and the European Union. And basically, the value of the currency is based on the supply and the demand of the currency on the actual foreign market exchange, whereas fixed exchange rates are usually when there is a commodity currency, a fixed value based on some sort of a commodity, whether it be gold, silver, oil, beans, or whatever. The prices then for the floating exchange is based on how much in demand that currency is on the global market, whereas fixed exchange rates have this fixed price based on the value of that commodity, but the prices of the value of that currency rises or drops in relation to those commodities. Okay? And then the last main topic of discussion here would be developing economies. So that contrasts with our developed economies, which are basically our industrialized economies that have advanced technology, robust and diverse industrial and service sectors. When you're thinking about most of the West, a large chunk of Eastern Asia, you might be able to argue that there's a certain degree of developed status or development. And certain countries are making advancements in regard to that. So as far as developing countries are concerned, those are those countries that are currently engaged in economic transformation, usually towards industrialization, and again increased access to technology and a very diversified income. Now in developing countries, you tend to see certain characteristics like having long working hours and the exploitation of workers and potentially environmental damage as the result of the activities. And the developed countries are no exception to this. Back when they were developing, they engaged in the same sorts of things. So now there's a lot of concerns about some of these developing countries. Now that we're aware of the environmental damage and we're aware of the problems that can come as the result of these kinds of practices, what can be done to curtail the environmental damage while still allowing them to develop, or what can be done to ensure the positive experience of workers without stunting the development of those countries. So there's often a bit of an issue for these countries in terms of developing fiscal and monetary problems because they don't have the markets there that are able to allow them to rectify the issues that are coming about in their organization, or rather their countries in general, which based on its organization is very limited in terms of the kinds of industries and markets that are there, and so there's often not a lot of ability of the government to make the appropriate fiscal space to be able to initiate these sorts of changes. So they oftentimes have a lot of economic problems, which leads us to the BRICS nations, which are the current countries that are considered to have very significant growth in industrialization. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America. But really, if you look at it, China is far and away the most, the greatest comparatively in terms of the growth and industrialization that's taking place. China is kind of light years ahead of all the other countries in that regard. But nevertheless, Brazil, Russia, India, and South America, all very, very I'm sorry, that's supposed to be South Africa. I don't know why I put South America, and I've just said South America a few times because it's written there. But no, South Africa is what I mean to say in that slot there. I'm going to have to change this PowerPoint. Sorry about that. But yes, so China now has at least the second most robust economy in the world. Definitely the argument that they are very close to reaching the level of development of some of the Western countries, perhaps even now, not even necessarily 10 or 20 years in the future. and definitely slated to potentially being the largest economy in the world. India also being very robust with a very high population, the largest population in the world at present. Able to take advantage of that population to make significant strides in terms of its growth. And then, of course, the other countries doing the same as well. So, all of these different concepts in international trade are really important to kind of understand, on a macroeconomic level, what takes place internationally, not just domestically within the borders of a particular country. And so, it's important to kind of examine some of these factors that we talked about in greater detail. So, looking at some of those concepts and really coming to understand what basically allows a country to be able to acquire the goods and services that it needs on the international market that it isn't able to produce itself, and how it's able to generate profit and maintain national wealth from the export of goods and services that are created within its borders.